Hello everyone to this webinar. My name is Miriam Wagner. I am the Executive Director of the Wolf Institute in Cambridge, where it's a beautiful, beautiful evening. So thank you for joining us again at this webinar series that is run jointly by the Wolf Institute and by the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean, with partners in the CSIC, IMF, the University of Munich, the Medieval Studies Research Group at the University of Lincoln, Leicester Medieval Research Center and Ghent University. Many of you will be very familiar with the format of these webinars, but for those who are not, I'm introducing the two main host institutions of the series. It's the Wolf Institute, which is a research institution in Cambridge, which focuses on religion and society. And we combine our research with teaching, public education and policy work. And please have a look at the Wolf Institute website and on our YouTube channels to learn more about our work. And the second institution is the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean, which was founded in 1997 and which is dedicated to all aspects of the academic study of Mediterranean history from the 5th to the 15th century. And this is also always the moment when I introduce our journal, the Journal of the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean. And it's a very, very, very good journal. Please consider submitting your articles to the journal. It comes as part of the subscription of being a member of the society. It's a very, very good deal. So if you would like to join the society, have a look at our society webpage where you can find the appropriate link. So very quick introduction of how this webinar works. We have a Zoom webinar audience here, and we're also live streaming via Facebook. So if you want to rewatch this or if you want to recommend it to anyone, it's available from the Wolf Institute Facebook page and also very soon on the Wolf Institute YouTube channel. Our topic for the day is bees in the medieval Mediterranean, economic, environmental and cultural perspectives. I've been quite looking forward to this webinar. Actually, I've been unduly excited about this topic ever since one of the group, of the KCL group that work on bees presented at the Wolf Institute in October about the bees. So I'm extremely anxious and enthusiastic about our webinar today. And our chair will be Dr. Roser Salicrú, who is a very long-term collaborator of the society, who will then in turn introduce the speakers of today. And just very quickly, a summary of how this is working. So the panelists will present and have a short discussion among themselves and with the chair, while you can prepare questions for the Q&A session that we will have afterwards. You can type the questions in the Q&A portal on the bottom of your screen. Please put it only in the Q&A session. If you put it in the chat, it's much, much more difficult for the chair to handle. And this is now the time to introduce our chair and hand over to our chair, Roser Salicrú. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Miriam. First of all, I am pleased to share this webinar today on bees in the medieval Mediterranean, economic, environmental, and cultural perspectives with two speakers. Our first speaker will be Alexandra Sapoznik. She's a senior lecturer in late medieval history at King's College London. Her research focuses on the economic history of the later Middle Ages. She has published on peasant agricultural productivity in England, agricultural technology in Northern Europe, and credit networks in the German Hanse region. Between 2018 and 2021, she led the Leverhulme-funded project Bees in the Medieval War, which grew from the hierarchical bees in the medieval economy, the research for which was funded by the British Academy and published in the Economic History Review. As you may know, bees and bee products were of tremendous cultural significance in the later Middle Ages. Wax was necessary for many aspects of Christian religious devotion, while honey held a particular importance in medieval Islam. In this session, our speakers will examine how these cultural preferences drove a lucrative and far-reaching trade in beeswax, combining the products of domestic apiculture and large-scale imports to support increasingly costly and spectacular forms of Christian devotion demonstrating interconnections of economy, environment, and culture in the pre-modern world. Alexandra is now going to introduce the BEES project and some of its conceptual underpinning, and we will then hand over to our second speaker, Lluis Fava, who will talk about some of the findings of the project, e.g. the division of trades in wax and honey, the nature and scale of the wax trade, and some aspects of consumption. I thus give first the floor to Alexandra. Alex, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And Lluis is going to share the screen. It's a shared PowerPoint. So we'll see if Lluis can share the screen. He did a moment ago. Super. Okay, excellent. Can you click to the first slide, please? I have to apologize. I live under the flight path for the airport. So if you hear lots of noises, it's the airplanes coming home to nest for the evening. So as you've just heard, the talk for this evening comes from the project Bees in the Medieval World, Economic, Environmental, and Cultural Perspectives. I was the principal investigator, and I was more than ably assisted by Lluis, who studied the Crown of Aragon and the Mediterranean more broadly, and Mark Whelan, who is the member of the team who can't be here this evening, but who was so utterly charming at the Wolf Institute that he got us this invitation. And he looked at the Hansa region and German-speaking Europe more broadly. And we looked at the production, trade, and consumption of wax and honey from 1200 to 1600, collected about 17,000 observations of indications of trade and consumption from over 40 markets across our 2 trading zones. And this was the first large-scale study of bees, beekeeping, and bee products in pre-modern Europe. And it was the first attempt to quantify the nature and scale of that trade. Now, you might be wondering why bees, which would be a good question. Bees are cool, and obviously everyone should be interested in pollinators. But more importantly, bees and bee products were intrinsically important to pre-modern societies across Europe and the Mediterranean world. And so bees provide a vantage point from which to consider interconnections between economy, environment, and culture in the pre-modern world. And so I should say we're going to look at wax mostly today, but we have a lot to say about honey, and we're happy to discuss that in the questions. So the fundamental importance of bees lay in the natural philosophy of our medieval protagonists. And to understand why bees were important to medieval societies, we have to understand what medieval people thought about bees. Because it turns out that medieval people thought a lot about bees. They had lots of ideas about bees, and they drew their ideas from antiquity. So here are a few examples on the slide of what medieval people drew from antiquity and how they developed this idea. So we have Aristotle in the 4th century, who says that bees neither copulate nor give birth. It's an idea that's picked up by Pliny the Elder, who says that bees can be revived if they're covered in mud and ox carcass. So this is a process called bugonia. And Pliny thought that you beat a cow to a pulp and you bury the cow, and the cow pulp would grow worms, and those worms would turn into bees. You can try that if you feel the urge. Augustine of Hippo wrote that bees are born without sexual intercourse. And this idea, again, is picked up by Isidore of Seville, the last of the church fathers, who wrote that, well, in his etymologies, he says, of course bees originate from oxen, just as hornets come from horses, drone bees from mules, and wasps from asses, reflecting the medieval belief that bees were the tiniest of birds, which sprang spontaneously from the putrefying flesh of cows. And this idea, though, about the spontaneous generation was picked up most importantly for us in our project by the Galician Sacramentary of the 8th century, in which it's noted that bees are chaste and in them virginity becomes fruitful. So medieval people thought that bees were chaste and virginal. They observed no mating in bee colonies, and the implications of this were profound. Medieval theologians associated the virginity and chastity of bees with the two figures whose virginity and chastity were central to the Christian faith, Christ and Mary. And this religious symbolism had a singularly important practical consequence because it meant that beeswax candles were required for the observance of the Mass. And over time, as religious observance became more elaborate, the uses for wax candles also expanded. So on the next slide, we have sort of a list of where you might find candles if you were to walk into a medieval church. This is obviously not to memorize, but it's just to say that if you went into a medieval church, you'd see candles everywhere. And the amount used in churches could be enormous. The Paschal candle alone could weigh over 100 kilos. And just as candles marked every stage of the liturgical year, so too did they mark every stage of life, from baptism to burial, from life into death, into life everlasting. And so the need for beeswax was constant and pervasive. So the question then is, where did this wax come from? So we have a map of Apis mellifera and its various subspecies, which were all adapted to particular environments. And obviously it's easier to support honeybees in some places on this map than others. And there were lots of different ways of keeping bees that were also adapted to particular environments and types of landscape. And in the Mediterranean, we see highly developed forms of transhumant apiculture, which developed, and the hives were moved between summer and winter foraging areas like sheep. And honey was harvested 2 or even 3 times a year. And since wax is produced to store honey, these were also areas of relatively high wax production. And yet nowhere along the Christian coasts of the Mediterranean was demand for wax met by local supply. So essentially within the Mediterranean or the northern Mediterranean basin, we have a region that produces lots of honey. This honey is used as part of long distance export that Lluis is going to talk about a bit, I think. But they don't produce enough wax, even though they're producing quite a lot domestically. And instead, the cities of the northern Mediterranean, just like the cities of Northern Europe, were absolutely reliant on large-scale wax imports. And we estimate that about 3.5 million kilos of wax were taxed annually at Europe's major ports. And this is surely a significant underestimate of the total amount of wax that was imported into Europe and which existed alongside domestic production because of all of the tax exemptions that were given to various groups. And so what we have here is a sort of that same map, but with some of our wax trading cities. And there were 2 main wax producing zones on the periphery of Europe: the hinterland of the Baltic, so this area between Warsaw, Lvov, Smolensk, and Novgorod, which was, and North Africa. And Baltic wax was of very high quality. It was a pillar of Hanseatic trade. It was produced in vast bee forests. But the second production zone was North Africa. And here, especially inclement weather and extensive fire regimes, which enhanced the quantity and quality of bee forage, meant that beekeeping was especially productive. But the preponderance of wax from this region, especially that for export, was due to a confluence of environmental and cultural factors. And that takes us to another set of ideas about bees. Because Christians weren't alone in seeing something of the divine in bees. Bees held an important place in Islam as well. The bee is singled out as the only non-human entity for non-human animal for direct revelation in the Quran. Muslims too saw powerful symbolism in bees, believing them to demonstrate God's omnipotence in the combination of sweet honey and sharp venom. But whereas for Christians, this symbolism played out in the need for wax, in Islam, it was honey that was prized above all. So we have some examples here of honey being picked up in this way. So in the Quran, honey is called healing for mankind, a sign for those who give thought. And following from this, prophetic medicine placed great emphasis on the healing powers, physical and spiritual, of honey. Paradise was said to run with rivers of clear honey. And we have several hadith by Ibn Majah in the 9th century that demonstrate these protective and curative powers of honey. It was reiterated by both Ibn Majah and al-Bukhari that the Prophet Muhammad had enjoyed sweet foods and honey. Honey in great quantities was consumed for the celebration of the Mawlid, the nativity of the Prophet Muhammad. But Muslims had no special need for wax, and millions of kilos of unprocessed wax were shipped to the Christian ports of the northern Mediterranean. And this framing of the interconnection of economy, environment, and culture was the underpinning of the project, and Lluis is going to expand on some of the findings and sources that we've looked at for the project.
Am I still showing the screen? We should.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Alexandra. And we will now give the floor to Lluis Fava. Lluis Fava obtained his PhD on medieval history at the Universitat de Girona in Catalonia. He has specialized in the study of private credit and non-payment in rural contexts during the medieval period. He has worked with unpublished documents issued by local jurisdictional civil courts to describe the mechanisms through which default was pursued, and thus upheld the credit market. In different publications, he has underpinned the capacity of serf peasantry in Catalonia to get involved in actions in court in defense of their own economic interests. He has also focused on other aspects of the peasants' standards of living, especially on commercial livestock breeding and on the trade of commodities in small towns in northeastern Catalonia. In recent years, Lluis has been involved as a postdoctoral researcher in Alexandra's bees project, for which he has visited dozens of archives in the Western Mediterranean basin, from Avignon to Palermo, from Rome to Lisbon. He has worked with toll accounts in order to assess the traffic of wax and honey from the Maghreb to Iberia, Provence and the Italian peninsula, as well as to get an impression of the eastern trade of wax in the Black Sea and Bulgaria to the Western Mediterranean. In the sphere of consumption, he has explored a great array of ecclesiastical accounts in which the use of wax and honey was recorded. Right now, he's working as an associate researcher at the Instituto de Estudos Medievais of the Universidade Nova de Lisboa in Portugal on a project about commerce of selected products like dried fish, cloth, saffron, honey, during the late 15th and 16th centuries in Barcelona. Lluis, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roser, for this introduction, and I want to thank you also the organizers of this seminar for having us here today. I'm gonna try to be really brief, and as Alex was introducing, I'm gonna deal with the demand, the trade, and if I have time, the nature of wax in the Western Mediterranean, focusing here today because, well, for a matter of time, on the case of the Iberian Peninsula mostly. Okay, I like wheat and barley, the cereals mostly consumed by the Mediterranean popular classes. Wax had also to be shipped from abroad, generally, due to a permanent deficit in its domestic production. Yields provided by hives could vary considerably according to the location, to the climate, to the hive type, and to the management. The warmer climatic conditions in the Mediterranean made possible, as Alex has advanced as well, 2 full harvests a year, maybe sometimes even 3. The first being in late spring, and the second one, Citra exitum mensis septembris, according to the same wording of the Statutum Macerarium of King Manfred of Sicily of 1254. Figures provided by modern research and historical treatises suggest that one single hive, could generally produce around 3.5 liters of honey, not much, and probably not more than 1 kilogram of wax per season. That is a low output of wax per hive compared to contemporary beekeeping indeed. Given that the religious institutions alone in a city such as Barcelona, like the one you have on the screen, between the 14th and 15th centuries, needed a bare yearly minimum of 5,500 kilograms. If we try to interpolate, or at least imagine this figure for the whole Christendom, it becomes clear that wax had to be demanded from abroad. On the contrary, the above-mentioned larger output for honey allowed the Mediterranean countries, and especially the Iberian Mediterranean facade, to be self-reliant on this product and to be able to export it to the Eastern Mediterranean demand and also towards Northern Europe. Given this demand for wax, we assess a well-organized system of supply for which the route from Northern Africa, from Tunisia, from Tlemcen, from Morocco, from coastal Atlantic Morocco, was key during the late Middle Ages. In this strait, Mallorca, the island of Mallorca, performed as a key entrepot, at least until the turn of the 16th century. This demand for wax was present in the political and diplomatic developments of the period. Some examples that I could mention are the agreements between the King of Tunis and Genoa in 1287, who settled the exportation policy of the latter with the Christian kingdom, who would levy a specific toll on all exportations of wax. Shortages of the product, deliberate economic policies, and also retaliation frequently fostered bans on wax. In 1272, the Portuguese crown had forbid all exports of wax, honey, as well as hides and cumin from the Algarve, except if these commodities left through ports from which they could be properly taxed. While in 1446, wax would be included amongst other domestic staples in the trade ban with the Moors, a total trade ban in this case. Wax produced in the Maghreb served the needs of the Europeans, defining an integrated market in which natural resources were extracted from the south in exchange of generally low-value manufactured goods from the north. It has to be said that domestic waxes from inland of the Christian regions, and I'll be dealing with that afterwards, if not during the debate, would start seriously competing in the urban markets from circa 15,000 onwards. Fragmentary evidence from notarial registers and surviving tax records hints at the constant flow of wax across the Mediterranean. The Valencian Manifest de la Mar, which recorded royal taxes on ships docked at the Grau, which is the natural harbor of the city, indicate that in 12 selected years between 1459, and that is what you have on the screen, and 1558, of around 120,000 kilograms of wax, a lot of wax, which arrived into Valencia by sea. Almost 85%, 83.7%, was imported directly from the central Maghreb. Thus, despite the Ottoman rule and the privateer activity in Algiers at the turn of the 16th century, the Maghreb was still an important supplier to the Christian north. The map shows the flow of this trade to Valencia, and as has been noted, most of the remaining wax arriving from the Balearics, from also southern Iberia and Atlantic Andalusia, was also of North African origin. The manifests, the stacks, further demonstrate the significant role of Italians, of Maghrebi Muslim merchants, including also Mudejares, Moriscos, in addition to Christian merchants from Valencia itself. A separate series of royal taxes, the so-called Dret del Vinte, which was levied on commodities imported only by Jews into the Crown of Aragon, show that between 1398 and 1412, at least 12,000 kilograms were brought to Valencia by Jewish merchants based in North Africa. Jews from both shores of the Mediterranean might have taken advantage of their kingship networks to fetch the best product, and were particularly active in the trade from Oran and Hunain, areas to which Mallorcan and Valencian Jews had fled after the attacks of 1391, in addition to having a significant presence in Tunis and Fez. For instance, in 1410, the merchant David Susi of Fez sent to Valencia almost 2,200 kilograms of wax in one single shipment. And I am going to deal with a little bit with honey, and I think I'm going to leave it here afterwards. We can enter into the debate. Similar analysis of the Manifest of Valencia, of what we've seen with wax, we've done it also with honey. You have to know that the manifests give comprehensive information about the origins of the commodities traded. And in this case, they demonstrate how Tortosa, the city of Tortosa in southern Catalonia, and the northern coast of Castelló in the northern kingdom of Valencia were the main, indeed, regions which provided honey to the city. As shown in this new map, This zone sent as much as 3/4 of the liters of the honey transported by sea to Valencia between 23, not 59, and 1558. Other regions, such as the coast of Tarragona and Barcelona in Catalonia, were far less prominent, and zones such as Alicante or North Africa were simply marginal for this specific trade. You might notice that this makes a sharp contrast with the provision of wax, which the same source shows to have been essentially conducted from Algiers, from Iran, and the surrounding seaports. Wax and honey were clearly dissociated in the market. Regions praised for their honey usually did not export wax, and vice versa. Selected flora yields palatable honey, yet produces wax which is less suited to candle making. Likewise, the amount of honey produced in a traditional beehive surpassed wax in a proportion of 5/3 to 1, thus, as we've said, not meeting the demand of Christian lands, which were in permanent need of wax for their liturgy. And I think I'm going to leave it here and leave space for the debate. We've got, I think, plenty of other things to discuss about the nature of the product, about the prices, about the changes over time of this wax trade, but I think it's worth leaving it up to the participants. Oops.
Okay, thank you very much, Lluis. Well, it's clear that the project is wide-ranging, and there is a lot they didn't have time to talk about. So the Q&A is open for any comments or questions you may ask. There's none right now. And we were about 40 people, so I think, although everything was very clear, well, so I'll try myself to ask a question then. Your research focused especially on trade, circulation. What about production? Because I guess that, of course, sources give us the evidence of the circulation, but did you find any new evidences on the production?
Can I answer? Yeah. I think, unfortunately, we know, or the reality is that we know much more on production from the north, from the Christian countries, than we know from the south, from this vast zone of production for wax. So yes, indeed, we've come up with many new ideas, I think, on wax, on both wax and honey production of the Christian countries. For instance, we've found out that, albeit it is true that in many households, for instance, in Catalonia, apiculture or beekeeping was a subsidiary activity. In many, it really was. In others, and in specific regions, specifically inland Catalonia, to the zone of Teruel, inland the northern kingdom of Valencia, where there seems to be a specialized social sector on beekeeping, and this can be seen, for instance, through the Generalitat, through the tolls of entry and exit of Catalonia, through which we see lots, especially of honey, coming in from Teruel into Catalonia. So, well, we know that there were some zones in which honey was beginning, especially honey, was beginning to be a specialized activity by peasants and by merchants. But we know less, indeed, about the production in Northern Africa. And, well, the presumption is rather that this should have been a centralized production regarding the large amounts of wax being in routine sent off towards the northern Mediterranean.
Okay, thank
you.
Do you want to add some? Yeah.
How this was
centralized. To say that part of the sort of goal of the project was to see the extent to which we could use production of bee products, of honey and wax, to test things that we sort of intuit about the nature of the medieval environment and aspects of climate change. So could we use wax prices, for example, as an indicator of climatological change? That was the ultimate sort of goal. And the answer is no, because we don't know enough. And so it's a really good question, actually. The only way that we know about this sort of vast amount of production is sort of the shadow behind the heart, to take a phrase from Nabokov, that we see it sort of reflected in the trade, but we've really struggled to get further into that. But I can say, to give you like an indication of the scale of this trade, it's about by volume, about 0.5%. That of the grain trade, which, as you know, is the greatest trade in the medieval world. But by value, it's 30% that of the grain trade. So it's hugely lucrative and important. It's just being able to see like how is it actually produced that was the challenge that we sort of failed.
Okay, thank you very much. There is now a number of questions. The first one, really very interesting. Thank you for fascinating, I guess. I am very much not a specialist in the Mediterranean, but did you encounter any discussion on the cross-cultural religious implications of reliance of imports for the liturgy from outside of Christendom?
Well, yes, up to a point. We have an article in Medieval Encounters about that. But I think that it's something that really does merit further consideration. It's not just that so much Christian religious observance is obviously predicated on an import from the lands of Islam, but also that because of this really extensive trade from the southern Mediterranean into the north, that particular kinds of religious devotion could actually develop. So they can only use lots and lots of wax because they have lots and lots of wax. So these kinds of really sort of very extravagant wax consuming expensive forms of Christian religious devotion are absolutely reliant on the lands of the Maghreb. And I think that is something that sort of conceptually merits much further consideration.
Okay. Now, one, thank you, Alexandra. Lluis, fascinating talk. Can you say a bit more about the Jewish involvement in wax trading?
Well, again, I would point you to the article in Medieval Encounters, but what we can see through the, so the sources are the taxation records that Lluis mentioned, which specifically tax Jewish trade. So, I mean, that's an aspect of Jewish trade, is that because they're liable for different taxes, they get recorded separately. And sometimes you have those records and sometimes you don't. And for some years for Valencia, we do have those records. We might from that intuit that there is a particular space for Jewish merchants and for converso merchants, because the trade in wax causes some religious concern among Muslims, among Muslim jurists. And so it allows them to trade wax in a way that maybe, or in an orthodox way that they wouldn't necessarily be allowed to. Obviously, in real life, they do trade directly with Christians. But we might say that, especially because Jewish merchants from that part of the world are particularly well embedded in those networks, that they have a particular sort of ability to work within them. And also they're excluded from other kinds of trade. They don't tend to trade so much in the grain trade.
Okay, again, hello, many thanks for the stimulating talks. And with apologize, there has been a lot of discussion of the moral spiritual economy in the early Middle Ages recently. ideas before the period you study. I wonder whether you have any views on the trade in wax honey between circa 700 and circa 1200 in the Mediterranean. Was it robust? Is there evidence, or is it produced within self-contained economic zones?
If I may, it is a chronological span that we haven't studied, but it is true that there are some references, especially I'd say in the Eastern Mediterranean. I remember references of wax from the Dalmatian coast getting to Ancona, for instance, in the 11th or 12th century, if I remember quite well. So there are evidence, or there are evidences of wax being shipped through the international trade, especially during the turn of the millennium. But I would say, I would venture to say that most of the wax and honey trade in that period was of domestic nature, or was inland. Generally, but again, it's not a time span we have focused on.
I would also say Novgorod ships, really vast amounts of wax are coming from Novgorod into the Black Sea in that time period. What we would probably say from our findings is that there isn't necessarily that need for interregional trade in wax before probably the 12th, 13th centuries, because the liturgy hasn't developed to such an extent that there is this really huge need for it. And it only becomes, really important in Christian liturgical practice once it's codified into how many candles you have to have on the altar, once the altars become bigger, once the doctrine of purgatory becomes more highly developed.
The invention of Corpus Christi, for instance, of a festivity of Corpus Christi, or Candlemas gaining importance, has lots to say in the wax supply to the Western Christian countries. Yeah. And this is something that can clearly be seen, especially throughout the 14th century, when you see more and more wax being shipped from Northern Africa, or even from the Black Sea, from the Genoese colonies in the Black Sea towards the Western Mediterranean.
Well, thank you. Then, are there any sources which discuss the different material qualities of wax from different geographical origins? In particular, were some areas particularly prized for specific material qualities? Mm-hmm. And I will take advantage of my position as a chair, and I would have the same question about honey, if possible.
But honey, okay. Let me focus first on wax, and this was a question that I had prepared. In fact, we have explained so far that wax was fetched mostly from the Maghreb. But the more, for instance, in Iberia, but also in Italy, the more steam product seems to have been harvested inland, the one made in the Christian countries themselves. So that Cera della Terra in Italy, or Cera della Terra in Catalonia, for instance, if it's in Pisa or Catalonia, seems to be always the most expensive, and the one that institutions put the most effort into to collect. To this regard, for instance, we know about the logistical efforts of certain institutions, religious institutions, such as, for instance, the Luminaria, which is an institution or an office within the Cathedral of Barcelona. We know about its efforts during, especially the 16th, but also the 15th century, to fetch domestic wax. And we know, for instance, that this wax was generally sold by petty traders who would have sometimes been producers themselves. What else can I say, for instance, in regards to production? Well, that systematically, and this is something that we have proved, this wax, Cera della Terra, was systematically more expensive than the one arriving from the Maghreb. And why was that so? Could be explained because of the inland transportation costs, but also some chronicles do assess that this was a more steam quality, a wax that was more esteemed, that it had a better performance, that it burned better, that it didn't make as much smoke as the wax that came and that had to be whitened from the Maghreb. Anyway, both waxes had to be whitened. To the contrary, with the wax that came from Northern Europe, that was already provided in the hubs and white. But anyway, we do know that domestic wax was generally more or better appreciated than the one coming from the Maghreb. But the main difference is the one coming from the Maghreb was necessary to fulfill the necessities of especially the Christian or the religious institutions of the Western Mediterranean. And in regards to honey, what can we say? This is something that I hadn't prepared, but we know lots about a specialization of honey. I've mentioned the specialization of honey of certain regions around what we could say central Crown of Aragon, the province of Teruel, inland Catalonia, northern Kingdom of Valencia. And we know very well, thanks especially to the works of Damien Coulon, that this honey from the last quarter of the 14th century up to 1440 was shipped off to the Eastern Mediterranean, and especially to Alexandria. We know that Catalan honey, as well as honey from the Languedoc, was especially appreciated in that region. It has to be said, though, that afterwards, that honey, would be reintroduced into the domestic trade, to the domestic markets. But in general, we do know that some regions, for instance, I'm thinking about the Provence as well, with its chestnut honey, where honeys that were specifically appreciated by the consumers.
Yeah, so just to say that there are only some, so everywhere produces honey, there are only some places where honey is produced that's exported and that people want to buy it from. So we intuit from that these are the places where there's especially high quality honey. And Eliyahu Ashtor was also wrote about price differentiation in honey. And the interesting thing, as Lluis has said, is that these places are completely separate from the wax producing places.
Now a question about long-distance transport of wax and honey. Did merchants or honey wax producers develop new technologies for preserving, transporting those products to Northern Europe?
Very interesting. I would venture to say that we didn't know. We know about a special pottery canters or recipients that were made, for instance, in Portugal. They were made in Portugal, sent off to their colonies in coastal Atlantic Morocco. Then there they were filled with honey and sent off again northbound to Portugal, or even even to the northern European countries. But we don't really know about specific ways of preserving honey. Well, wax they did not have the same needs, but honey did actually. We don't really know. We don't really know about specific ways of preserving honey and those transports really.
Okay. Then you already mentioned the Eastern Mediterranean somehow, but now the question is, do you maybe have any information, literature tips, possible sources about beekeeping, wax and honey trade for the medieval Eastern Adriatic region?
Well, we do. That was mostly the Venetian market. That was the zone of influence of Venice. Most wax and honey produced in those regions were shipped to Venice. And after the loss of the Genoese colonies in the Black Sea, they would pursue the Venetians to fetch honey and wax from especially the Dalmatian coasts. Although some of that, especially wax in that case, was produced inland, even in Bulgaria. So actually during the late years of the 14th century, we have evidence of Zagora wax from Bulgaria, arriving up to the Western Mediterranean, to the market of Barcelona, to the market of Pisa, to the market of Marseille, for instance, and that is actually the most esteemed wax that ever gets there, and it is the most expensive. So we do have evidence of wax from that zone arriving to the Western Mediterranean, although it's a market controlled mostly by the Venetians. Yes.
Well, right now it's the last question in the Q&A. How would you begin to go about discerning how wax or honey is produced at this volume in any of these environments? I have seen one reference in a charter, for example, to beehives, in a list of property associated with the monastery of Buenafuente in Castilla, 13th century. I am curious if there's other kinds of potentially more informative evidence. Regulations, perhaps?
Yes, so I mean, it's one of those sort of situations where you don't get the full picture from one source, but once you get several sources, you can sort of triangulate and start to see things. And so there are lots of different forms of beekeeping, and they take place, they're embedded in the different forms of land management and land use within the region. And so it's not surprising that monasteries have beehives, although I've often thought that monasteries keep bees as sort of symbolic reminders of what a perfect colony is supposed to be like, rather than to actually produce for the monastery, because there's no way that what monastery has in terms of beehives could produce what it actually needed. We see these also in England, that they have bee niches in the walls of monasteries, but it's highly regulated. You know, one of the first questions that I had when I started the project was, could anyone keep bees? Because I'm not a beekeeper. And in places where there is large-scale beekeeping, so especially in the Mediterranean, less so in parts of Northern Europe, we see lots and lots of regulation about how to keep bees. And that tells us how people are keeping bees and some ideas about bees. And Lluis will probably remember much more clearly the different kinds of regulations that they have about sort of how far away from cities they have to be, how you have to keep them away from vineyards, how you're supposed to keep them away from livestock. All of these things indicate domestic beekeeping rather than wild honey hunting. And also in the Maghreb, we can say that it's domestic beekeeping because the fatwas about it indicate that they're being kept rather than being sort of foraged for in the wild. But Lluis, do you have anything more to add?
No, I'd only add that to it, which was, well, in synthesis is what we have, that wild bees were also regulated in a way. You know, I was reading the other day, and I was telling you, Alex, that I had found a legal suit against two men that had captured apparently 3 or 4 hives. It wasn't clear how many from a forest without the Lord's permission. So that was regulated as well. And we have evidence. Well, this specific lawsuit belonged to Northern Catalonia, but we found we found examples also of the regulation of wild. Of if you can capture or not, and in which terms you can capture them from Portugal, from Northern Castile. So it was in general an activity that was highly regulated, indeed. Both we'd say the wild one and the one that wasn't wild, the one that was kept in beehives, man-made.
Just to say that we also have an article about beekeeping in medieval Europe as well, which also touches on, well, half of it's about the Mediterranean.
There is another question in the Q&A, which relates more or less on what you were saying, but did you find evidence, perhaps you want to add something, did you find evidence of organizational structures such as guilds related to wax, honey, or beekeeping the areas you looked at? And if not, what entities are controlling and regulating prices, practices, etc., outside of England?
Outside of England.
Outside of England.
Okay. From up to the 17th century, I'd say there is only evidence of collective organization of beekeepers, that is guilds, confraternities, what they call ligayos or mestas in Castile. That is the only place, especially in Toledo and in Andalusia, where we have traced, actually not us, but other authors have traced the existence of such organizations. And this is certainly not the case still up to the 17th century for Aragon, and as far as we know, neither for the Provence or Italy. And I think that is giving us an indication of not a very well organized system of domestic beekeeping, or not a very highly centralized way of organizing beekeeping. What else?
In terms of wax candles, those are regulated.
Indeed, yeah, consumption is regulated. A demonstration of which candles you can use in which circumstances are certainly regulated. But if it comes to production, that is not as regulated as, for instance, the case of Castile, which is the only one. But certainly, production, consumption, is highly regulated by local ordinances, by guild ordinances, for instance. Well, this is clearly an overview of it.
Roser, I think you're muted.
Yeah.
Sorry, thank you. No, I was saying that there is a question in the chat as well. Although my question is a little before the time period discussed today, do you happen to know of any sources about wax or honey trade that took place to from the British Islands in or before the year 1000 AD?
Well, 1000 is very early. And as you know, our main source is Doomsday, which is obviously just a little bit after 1000, but Doomsday harkens back to the time of Edward the Confessor. And so if we look at Doomsday, then we can see that in some places, especially places on the border with Wales, the number of hives between when Doomsday was taken and in the time of Edward the Confessor, they're both recorded. And so they'll say things like, there are 5 hives now, but there were 10 hives, TRE. And so we can see from that there was in some places extensive beekeeping. Obviously not everyone recorded all of the beehives, but it indicates, I think, particular importance in some regions of England of beekeeping. Doomsday doesn't, of course, cover all of Britain. It doesn't even cover all of England. And so, and that's just about production. Trade is really much more difficult for this period to see. And I can't answer that question at all, except to say that it seems like there's quite a lot of honey production in England. And in a period when you don't have that much need for wax, it's possible that most of it was being produced domestically. But if it wasn't, then we would imagine it to be coming from northern France. I would think, that's just a guess. But I mean, it's an interesting question about how long these trade routes have been in use.
Well, any additional question? Antonella, perhaps?
I have
Sorry
to
for
say that the
that.
question, no, because some of the questions have been sort of answered, and I don't know, one was about was there like a prestigious nature of a specific type of wax that was regarded as special, and whether that is associated to a specific liturgical event or to a specific area, i.e. there's a special import of a specific type of wax in an area for some reason. I don't know if that question makes sense, but I was just wondering.
I think it definitely does. Well, yes, there, as I've mentioned, generally speaking, and this is again an overview of what, well, can you see me? Yes. This is again an overview of what we've seen for the whole of the Western Mediterranean. Generally, the domestic production wax was more esteemed than the one that came from the Maghreb, which, according especially to Orozco, which was a chronicle of the late 16th century, didn't burn as well as the one that was produced inland. Probably it was better rendered, it was better made. We don't really know why, for instance, the wax from Valencia was more esteemed than the one arriving from Morocco. We don't know, but generally speaking, this was so, and this can also be traced through systematically through the prices. In the same spot, in the same moment, you see that white wax that has been harvested inland in Catalonia is systematically more expensive than the same white wax coming from the Maghreb. And I'm deliberately talking about white wax, but because both waxes, actually all waxes produced in the Mediterranean, had to be whitened. You could use yellow wax. Actually, many ceremonies allowed for yellow wax, but for instance, for the candle that had to be placed on top of the altar in every single mass, that specific candle had to be made of white wax. And obviously the Paschal candle, which was a very important candle in terms of weight during the Christian liturgical year. For instance, you have to think that in the Cathedral of Barcelona during the 15th century, on average, the one single Paschal candle weighed more than 120 kilograms, and that is a lot of wax. Well, that wax, in principle, had to be white. Although there are some tricks here. They sometimes use only a white covering, while the inside is made of yellow wax or even of burnt blackish wax. So there are many circumstances through which, especially the religious institutions, can simply not regard the necessity of having a fully white wax, because it's a very, indeed, it is a very expensive product. I'm definitely going off topic, but the question was, is if there was well, a specific product or a specific zone that was more esteemed than others, and I'd say that generally speaking, wax from inland, wax made in those same Christian Western countries was much more esteemed than the one made in the Maghreb. Whilst it could happen something similar with honey, but I think with honey, what happens really is that well, the flavor depends and varies so much that you have regions, especially praised for the honey they produce, and that is the case indeed of the Provence. They have this especially blackish honey made of chestnut, and that is, we know, sold into the Roman markets. For instance, in Rome they consume lots of honey produced in Provence. We have also the honey produced inland Teruel in the Iberian Peninsula, in the Crown of Aragon. Specifically, we have honey produced in a town called Mequinenza, and honey from Mequinenza is the most esteemed honey consumed in Alexandria in Egypt. So we have different, what we call in Spanish, denominaciones de origen, well, specially labeled honeys produced in different zones according to its flavor.
Well, I think that with this question, we have to finish at least the recording and the live in Facebook. I just voted because the speakers didn't, that they have a project, the project website, which is still periodically updated. The address is https beesinthemedieval.wordpress.com. Thank you very much to the speakers, and thank you very much to all the attendees.